My name is Wendy Keetle, and Nathaniel is my son. The last time I saw him was on December 19th, 2017, and he's still missing. Nathaniel lived in the Westminster, Colorado area since he was born with his older two sisters and younger brother. Nathaniel was a great brother to his siblings. Him and his younger brother Seth played all the time. He loved Legos. He was always very respectful. He was never argumentative, just a very, very good kid. All of his brother and sisters, they all got along great, and they just had a good time.
My name is Ben Holmes, and I'm Nathaniel's father. Nathaniel, as a child growing up, he enjoyed music, hunting, and travel. He enjoyed doing a lot of things in his earlier years, baseball and things like that. And unfortunately, Nathaniel's mother and I divorced in 2009.
He was around 9 years old. It did affect him a lot. He was very much a mama's boy, and it was very hard on him to go through that event. We tried as best we could to make it as comfortable for him and make him know that he was loved by both his dad and myself. Nathaniel, as he got older, started to play the bagpipes like his father, and that was a really big part of his life.
He learned bagpipes at a remarkably quick rate, and he went from a very beginner status to a very accomplished status in a shorter period than I've ever seen anybody else accomplish that. One of my proudest moments of my life was playing bagpipes with Nathaniel at the Colorado Renaissance Festival, playing a tune that I wrote with my son. It was amazing.
Nathaniel, he's very smart, he's very intelligent, but school was something that was kind of at the bottom of the list for him. He would get bored, and then it would just kind of go sideways for him.
He was very bright, and he would pick things up quickly, but sometimes the pace was a little slow for him, so he would get distracted. And while he's interested in things, he would get distracted from his scholastic endeavors.
So Nathaniel was not doing great in public school. We thought that it was maybe too much pressure, just too many people. It just wasn't something that he enjoyed. So when he got into high school, we did try online school, which did not work because he was not self-motivated. So we put him in an alternative school.
At this point, Nathaniel was a junior in high school. School made promises that he could catch up on classes, that he would be on track for high school graduation. So we were very positive that he could, get his diploma and move forward from there. My son had a small group of friends, and he met a couple at his newer school, and I think they may have been a bad influence on him.
But he seemed to be less focused, and you could tell that maybe he was doing things he shouldn't be doing. We thought maybe he was dabbling in some marijuana and some other things like that.
Monday, the 18th, his behavior was quite unusual. He came home and he was very definitely chemically altered. I'd never seen him like this before, and I talked to him about that, and he said that he had tried some marijuana and he took a Xanax.
His dad was very frustrated because we thought that Nathaniel was on the right path. He had asked Nathaniel, where are you getting this? What are you doing with this? What are you doing? And he just shut down.
And I said, this isn't behavior that's tolerable. We can't do this kind of thing. And he did get in quite a bit of trouble. I was working that evening, so I sent him to his mother's to stay.
His dad did call me that afternoon and said that Nathaniel had taken some Xanax pills, so Nathaniel needs to stay with you tonight. Talk to him, kind of try and get him in his right space. So he came to the house, we ate dinner. You could tell he was in a different zone. And said, Nathaniel, this is not a path for you. You're too smart for this. We wanted to make sure he was safe, but I was concerned. I did find a few pills in his wallet. I didn't really even know what they were, quite honestly, but I just took them from him. And I said, you know what, you don't need this. And he got really, really worried, really almost scared, and said, I have to take those back to school. He goes, Mom, you can't take those. And well, I did, and I hid them, and I sent him to bed. The morning of the 19th, I got Nathaniel ready, took him to school. I sat in my car and I watched him go through the school doors, and I left. After I dropped him off, I went to work. I would say around 10 o'clock in the morning, I got a call from Nathaniel. He did not have a phone at that time. I believe it was broken and we didn't get him another phone. So he did not have any way to communicate with us other than, a friend's phone. I just assumed that he used a friend's phone from school. And he said his friend Michelle was going to pick him up for ice cream after school. This was a friend of his father's. And I said, okay, well, I'm gonna give her a call, and if she's gonna pick you up, then that's fine. And he said, okay, I love you. That was the end of that conversation. So immediately I called Michelle and I said, hey, Nathaniel said that you're gonna pick him up for ice cream. And she goes, no, I haven't talked to him for a few weeks. And I said, okay, that's weird. And so then I called his dad and I said, hey, Nathaniel said Michelle was picking him up. I'm gonna go to school an hour early and pick him up and just make sure that he doesn't try and go out the back door or do something with his friends or whatever's happening. So that's what we agreed upon. So I stayed at work, and about an hour before school got out, I went into the school office and I said, hey, I'm Nathaniel Holmes's mom and I want to pick him up from school. And they just looked at me and said, well, Nathaniel didn't go to class. And I said, what? I watched him go into school. And they said, well, he came to the office after first period and then he left. And that was the last time anybody saw from him. The school had no idea where he went or what he did. They just know he wasn't in class. So that's when I found out my son was gone. And I said, so my son walked in your school doors at 7:45 a.m. and he's gone. He's just gone. And I'm finding out at 2:30. And they didn't really have much of a response to me. I was visibly upset. I was angry. I was angry at the school. And so I left.
I really fault the school for a lot of things. They didn't inform me of anything. They didn't inform me that he had left the school. Had they done so, I would have had maybe a 4-hour jump on where he would have been. He would have been in the area. And they said, well, our policy is, we let the parents know that evening that their kid wasn't in school. And when I said that policy is problematic, they got on the defensive and they wouldn't give me much other information.
I immediately called that number back of the phone that he used, and it was just a random lady walking her dog in the park. She said, yeah, he just asked to use the phone. And she even said, she goes, I knew he was lying to you, but I figured he was just going to go do something.
We started looking in places that he might have gone, to the downtown area, to other parks, and I just was not able to find him at all. And it was pretty immediately terrifying. Probably around 5, we contacted the police because he was a missing person at that point in my mind.
I'm Detective Troy Gordonier of the Westminster Police Department, and I'm the detective assigned to the Nathaniel Holmes missing persons case. So the police department did receive a call from Ben Holmes, who's the father of Nathaniel Holmes, on December 19th of 2017. An officer went to the house and gathered some information from him to try and figure out a possibility of locating Nathaniel. The officer took the initial report and learned that Nathaniel had gotten in trouble in the previous day or two because there was some marijuana that was found and also some prescription pills. So basically, his dad had grounded Nathaniel for a time. And Nathaniel went to school, and that's where he left the school after his first class and just didn't return home. And he didn't have his cell phone, so the information was kind of limited. Detectives contacted the school and was able to speak with the principal at the school, because the information we had was that the principal was probably the last person that actually talked to Nathaniel before Nathaniel went missing. That's when detectives learned that Nathaniel had told him that he was no longer going to be attending that school, that he was moving. The principal told him to just go back to class, and Nathaniel didn't. Detectives followed up, and they found out from both parents that there was nobody moving anywhere. And what Nathaniel told the principal wasn't true.
That was really confusing to me, because I don't know why he would say he was moving, and I don't know why I would not have gotten a phone call from the principal saying, hey, Nathaniel's in my office saying he's moving. He's obviously distressed, but we did not get a phone call from the principal.
So we believe that he had a plan, and he didn't tell anybody about his plan.
I was heartbroken. At this point, I was scared. I wanted to believe that it was going to be okay and he would just show up at his dad's house and that would be the end of it. But I was so afraid for him. Inside my body, I knew something was wrong. And I knew that we needed to find him. But I remember the night before he went missing, when I found the pills in his wallet. He had true fear in his voice when I had taken them. And he wasn't a scared kid. He was not afraid of anything. But I think he was scared of something or someone. And that's what led him to leave.
As soon as we realized that he wasn't at the school and he wasn't able to be found at the moment, I was very concerned immediately. He was never missing before.
My name is Hannah Holmes. I am Nathaniel's older sister.
My name is Seth, and I'm Nathaniel's younger brother.
In that moment, I didn't really know what to think.
It was very out of character for him. It just happened all of a sudden, and there was no word from him or anything. He just disappeared.
I immediately posted to Snapchat and Facebook, my little brother is missing. We don't know where he is. He doesn't have a phone. If anybody has seen him, call us, call the police.
My name is Jake Severson, and Nathaniel Holmes is my close friend. I met Nathaniel out of high school in 2016. There's nothing I wouldn't do for him, and I always consider him the little brother I never had. That's why I spent so much time with him. From my perspective, Nathaniel was sort of sheltered by his parents growing up. His dad was very strict and had very high expectations of him. And I wanted to teach him things about the world and teach him, almost street smarts. He's so book smart, but he hadn't had a lot of real world experiences, and that's what he had me there for. Summer of 2017. A lot of us, me included, started kind of doing drugs and things like that. A lot of us were doing cocaine quite frequently. It just became really popular in that friend group, and I think, in turn, might have influenced Nathaniel too. I think that he thinks, well, Jake and everybody else is doing it. I want to try it too. It really evolved quickly. I went from just doing it here and there to we were doing it every day. We were spending a lot of money on it. It was towards the end of the summer. I started trying to clean myself up quite a bit because I kind of came to the realization how bad off I was, and I was trying to help him also because I started to worry about him. He would break down crying, telling me he didn't know how to stop. He didn't know what to do. He had asked me for help. And I would tell him, there's no way for me to help because you gotta help yourself. And you gotta want to be done with that. One day he would be like that, and then the next day he would be very gung-ho. Let's keep doing drugs. Why not? Who cares? What's the point in not doing them because life sucks anyway? The day before he went missing, he called me in secret and asking me to get him more drugs. And he was crying and pleading with me. I said, Nathaniel, please just go to bed. We'll talk in the morning. There's not much we could do at 11 o'clock at night right now. And that was the last time I spoke to him. The next day, he went missing.
Looking back on it now, when he had gone to this new school, he was a little bit withdrawn. Maybe it was, beginnings of drug usage. I'm not certain.
I think during the time that Nathaniel struggled, he did not open up to me or his dad as much. But you don't have a lot of control when your child is 16, 17 years old. But I guess we thought if we could get him over this little bump that he was in life. He was so young, he still had so much ahead of him that, we were just trying to make our way. And I think that he probably told us things that we wanted to hear or wanted to believe. And I think there's probably some things that we missed.
My son had been missing for a day now. I did go to some of his friends' house. I knocked, I said, have you seen him? What's going on? Was he at school? Did he talk to you? Did he say anything? And his friends all said no. Nobody has been forthcoming with information. It's all been very close-lipped.
I remember I got a message from a friend who told me that Nathaniel was missing and he was just gone. And nobody had heard from him, and he was answering his phone. I remember a couple friends and I decided, all right, we're gonna go out and we're gonna look for him, because we didn't think that the police or his family would be able to get much information, because a lot of people were afraid of incriminating themselves or others. So they're not gonna give out a lot of information when it comes to somebody who's on drugs. They're gonna protect themselves. So I figured if anybody could find him, it'd probably be our friends and I. And I remember we went around everywhere. We went driving, looking everywhere for him, but he was just nowhere to be found, and he just vanished. And nobody knew a thing. Nobody knew what could have possibly happened.
One of my fears is that somehow he got into these drugs and ended up owing these people money, and he feels that he can't come back. He thinks that he's somehow keeping us from danger.
Our friend group was almost kind of like a safety net for him, where we protected him from how sometimes outside drug dealers can be, how those types of people can be. They can be very dangerous. And so he did lean on me and others to kind of keep him safe from those kind of people, because he didn't know how to deal with that. But as Nathaniel's addiction started to get more severe, I absolutely think he tried to find cocaine from other sources. I think he felt like he could go on his own and try to find it, and which may have led to him making worse decisions or meeting the wrong people.
I never, ever in a million years would think my son would leave on purpose, that he would leave because I just want to run away from home. There was nothing for him to run away from here. So something or someone scared him.
I feel like he may have ripped off somebody. He may have stolen from somebody, stolen money, drugs, and ran away to protect his family from those people. Those types of people, they go for your family. They go for your people that are closest to you. And I think that Nathaniel could have been trying to protect them.
Those first few weeks when Nathaniel was missing, my hope was that this is only going to be a couple more weeks. He'll be home by Christmas, and no, now he'll be home by the first of the year. After a few months of him being gone, it even became more concerning to me, because it's like he disappeared off the face of the earth. He was just nowhere to be found.
I just kind of held on to hoping that maybe he would be in contact with me or somebody else to let somebody know that he was okay. And there was nothing for weeks and for months, until one day I was at my house and there was a well-known drug dealer who lived in the same apartment complex as me. And I see Nathaniel go into her apartment. I remember I called his dad, and I told his dad, I'm like, you know, we need to get the cops here, we need to get somebody here. Like, I swear I just saw Nathaniel here.
So in April of 2018, the Westminster Police Department received a tip that Nathaniel had been seen at an apartment on 60th Avenue. Detectives followed up with that and ended up speaking with a friend of Nathaniel's who said that Nathaniel had been hanging around this apartment complex, and this apartment possibly had drugs being used and sold out of the apartment. So detectives tried to follow up on that, and unfortunately, it didn't glean any information that Nathaniel, in fact, was at that specific apartment or had been around that complex. People the detectives spoke with said that they didn't know him and hadn't seen him around there. So that tip, unfortunately, didn't give us any more information.
He did have that friend, and he did say that he saw him. I'm not sure if he really believed that he did see him. He would know him if he did see him. But, you know, my question always is to the people who thought they saw him is why not stay with him and call 911? Nobody would do that. And that was probably the biggest frustration for me, but nothing ever became of it.
Nathaniel knew where I lived. There were 2 doors to get out of the apartment complex. There's a good chance he could have known that I was home and I could have saw him, and so he could have gone out the back door and exited a different way and gotten away a different route. I know it was nighttime, so there was a good chance he could have snuck away. There was also a good chance I could have not saw him at all. It could have been hope in my mind to see my friend, and so I don't know for sure if that was him or not.
We knew he would spend time with his friends around downtown Arvada, and there's a mix of people there, maybe some drug usage. There's a large transient population as well.
I felt in my heart as a mom that he was not far. I know my son is out there.
I'm Gregory Nieto. I've been a reporter with Channel 2 and Fox 31 for 23 years. Old Town Arvada has the water fountains, ice cream shops. Now you have a magnitude of breweries, a skate park. It's definitely a spot for adults and, of course, a lot of other teens to hang out. And like a lot of communities across the country, it's become kind of a haven, if you will, for homeless adults and homeless teens.
I know a lot of them, they like to hang out around the same parks a lot of us kids did. A lot of them were on drugs, along with the rest of us. I know whenever I was on drugs, I had some friends who were down there in that area who I would go to various houses and people's sheds, hanging out for hours with people, some people I haven't met before. So I think there was plenty of places for him to hide down there.
The atmosphere around the homeless community, especially for when you're dealing with kids or very young adults, it can be dangerous for them because they don't really know who they're hanging out with. There's drug use, there's people stealing from each other. It can be very dangerous for somebody who maybe hasn't been on the streets much. And with Nathaniel, the homeless community thing for him was probably fairly new and could present challenges of being assaulted or getting into other types of drugs, and also could possibly even get into other criminal acts.
Some 1,000 to 2,000 people are homeless or living on the streets of just Arvada itself. So even if Nathaniel was in Arvada, it might be tough to find him.
We'd go through Old Town every single day. Every road we drove down, we always were looking for Nathaniel because we felt that he had to be close and he had to be somewhere in there.
But I didn't want to frighten Nathaniel away if he was hiding with the transient population. I bought a couple different cars so I could do stakeouts in certain areas and not be in the same car every day, and none of that came to anything. At other times, I would buy clothes at the thrift stores, and I would go in the homeless population, kind of dressed down, just seeing if anybody had known or seen him, just hoping that somebody would give us some lead, but still no leads.
My mom and her friend and I, we made little care packages for homeless. We put his picture, our phone number, In with it. It had just some necessities maybe the homeless people would want. And I thought even if they grabbed the picture, just tossed it on the ground and took what was there, his picture was gonna blow somewhere. Somebody was gonna see it. Let's find him.
We drive by homeless shelters, camps, anywhere where like homeless are, trying to see if we can find them or if anybody knew any information.
When your greatest hope is that your son is wandering around with the homeless people, that really says something about the situation you're in.
I was so afraid for him. I wondered if he was hungry. I wondered all those things that you wonder as a mother. It is the worst feeling you can have as a mother, to not know where your child is.
A page was made for him on Facebook, Bring Nathaniel Home, and there's thousands of people joined to this page trying to find him. And the posters were the same photo because I wanted to make sure when people saw this photo, they knew it was Nathaniel.
Because of his Facebook page, on January 11th of 2020, this woman with Safe Harbor Counseling in Weatherford, Texas, contacted us stating that there was a young man that had gone into her office and was selling bread. He was very cordial, he was very nice. Later that night, she was at home and she was going through Facebook and she saw a missing person flyer on Facebook that was Nathaniel. She looking at the photo from the Facebook flyer, and based upon who she saw in her office, she thought it possibly could have been Nathaniel. So when she went back to work, she looked through video footage at the office. She was able to get some still photos of this young man and sent those to detectives here in Westminster.
When I received that tip, I thought it was the most credible one that we've had, and I thought, could this be him? Could this be the day we find him?
Nathaniel Holmes was last seen December 19th, 2017. If you have any information, please contact the Westminster Police Department at 303-658-4360.
Safe Harbor Counseling said that it's not unusual for members of some of the local churches around there who are helping people that have an addiction or suffer from some homelessness, that the churches will send those people out to sell bread so that they can help make some money. But looking at the photos that were provided, it was hard to say if that was Nathaniel or not. And so a positive identification couldn't have been made. But detectives followed up with some of the churches that are in that Weatherford, Texas area, but they did not recognize Nathaniel as being associated with them.
He did have an uncle in Texas, and he was sort of familiar with that whole area. I did see that picture, but I do not think it was him. I don't think it looked like him, enough like him. He hadn't been gone that long, and you would know your child, and I don't think it looked enough like him. There's probably some resemblance, just like the people who I stop on the street. You know, it's enough to where you say, hey, that could be him, but I did not think it looked like him, no.
By the time Nathaniel's 18th birthday rolled around, he had almost been missing for 1 year. I never would have thought I would be celebrating his birthday without him. We all got together at my mom's house. We made his favorite dinner, and we got all of our presents for him and put them in the middle, and it was really hard. It's still hard celebrating without him. It just doesn't feel right.
And Mom would still get him cake and presents, everything. It's very hard doing that when he's not there.
We really never thought he would be missing his 18th birthday. Trying to wrap your head around everything that is happening, along with having your other children have to live their lives also, it's hard.
The longer time goes on and the information that we have isn't fresh information, it does start to become a problem when you're trying to locate somebody. You don't have anybody else that you can try and follow up with. The longer somebody is gone, it becomes quite the challenge to try and find them. And they could be anywhere.
When we first reported on the story, there was still that sense of him as a child. But with the passage of time, you're not only considered an adult, but subliminally, I think, law enforcement looks at someone who's 18 as an adult and maybe has now the free will to do as they please.
At that point, I felt like he was still hiding. I had had the thought to myself, and I mentioned to other people that, well, Nathaniel's 18. And with that, Nathaniel knows he's not stupid. He knows when he's 18, he can make his own decisions. He can leave his house if he pleases, and it can be on his own.
At this point, I was very hopeful that we would come across Nathaniel just being with a transient population or hanging out with some of his friends and somewhat embarrassed about having been caught. I got in the car with my younger son. We drove around downtown. We drove around in Pueblo and in other states in nearby areas, New Mexico and Utah and Wyoming, anywhere that I would think that a transient population would gather. It's amazing how many homeless places there were, the little enclaves behind stores on the side of highways. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. So when I received the tip via Facebook from a truck driver that said they had seen somebody that was asking how to get to California, I was immediately interested in this. On the morning of Saturday, 2021, by a truck stop in Gallup, New Mexico, an individual who was either on drugs or having a mental breakdown, not sure which, but he was at least composed enough to ask me how long it would take to get to California. Figured he was hitchhiking to California by truck, so I told him at least 10 hours. Seeing his hands were shaking and breathing heavily, I told him he should probably go home and find a safe place to stay and wait out his drugs instead of the area he was in that was sketchy. It seemed to really upset him. He snapped, I got to get away from Colorado. I asked what he was wanted for, and he said he was being searched for by people in Colorado. I asked if it was okay for him to give me his name, and he just said, Nate Holmes. This truck driver in New Mexico went on to say that this man walked off, but she said that she did some Googling and found Nathaniel Holmes' missing poster from Westminster, Colorado. She said, I saw his photo and I can't tell it was him for sure. Longer hair and facial hair. Also nighttime, so hard to see. Wearing baggy black clothes and guessing been homeless or something for a while. Looked rough. It's also important, it's about 500 miles from Denver to Gallup, New Mexico. While this may sound like a lot to the ordinary person, truck drivers and trains can do 1,000 easy in a day.
It did seem weird that she said Nate. Now, I think maybe his friends might call him Nate. We as a family, I have never called him anything but Nathaniel. But if, my thinking was maybe he's changed his name to Nate, but I don't know. So that seemed a little bit weird, but it's always something you have to follow up.
So immediately upon getting that tip, we contacted the Gallup Police Department and they went to search the area within hours of the tip coming in, but it unfortunately was, 6 or 7 hours after the encounter that the tip came through Facebook. But we sent the police looking around the area. They looked at videos, but nothing came of it.
When we got that tip, and it really did seem viable, but then that hope is dashed, and it's almost like you feel like the day he left all over again.
It's a great disappointment after every lead comes to nothing. It is soul-crushing. It's absolutely soul-crushing.
At this point, we were not getting very many leads, and as a mother, you will do anything to try and find your child. I've never really reached out to psychics or spiritual guides before, but I was trying to reach at straws. And there was one person in particular that sat with me, and she talked about seeing Nathaniel's light. She said that his light was dimming some and that he was not in a safe place, but he was alive. She had pulled out a map, and she looked at the map, and she had said, I see him in California. And in September 2021, about 3.5 years after Nathaniel had been missing, we got a tip that somebody had spoke with him in a park in Oceanside, California. This person in Oceanside said that a man walked up to her and asked to borrow her phone. She said that he didn't use the phone, he just Googled the name Nathaniel Holmes.
And then he handed the phone back to her and walked off. And she said, it looked like it might have been him, but couldn't tell.
Knowing Nathaniel was always on Facebook, and I think the first place he would check, he was interested maybe would be to see what people were saying about him, or if anybody had any leads or anything like that. He may have been interested and trying to find out more information.
Ben called me and said, I don't know. And I said, we got to go with your gut.
Thought it was credible, and 16 hours later, I was in Oceanside, California.
We had no idea anything about California or how big Oceanside was. Well, by the time he got there, I think the lady who had originally messaged him kind of ghosted him again.
I tried to give, missing person posters to the police, but they sort of scoffed at that and said there are thousands of missing people wandering around here. We have thousands of transients, and they didn't seem very forthcoming in trying to help. So it came to nothing.
At any given time, there are more than 150,000 homeless people in the state of California. When you talk about the number of homeless encampments there in the state as well, it would simply be impossible for at least one individual to fly out there and search for their son.
The worry and the dread just continues to get worse. And I feel like we tried everything. Trying to live a normal life with a child missing is impossible.
We held the candlelight vigil on the 5-year anniversary of his disappearance. We sent up a little Chinese balloon with different sayings and writings and prayers to come home. And it definitely heartened me to know that the community is still behind us and still very hopeful.
I think as time goes on, it gets harder because now we're at 5.5 years. Nathaniel's 22 years old, and still nothing, still no sign of him, still nothing. It's a cold case.
If you've seen or heard of anything about my son Nathaniel, please just let us know. You can contact the Westminster Police Department. They're very thorough and they're very good at their job.
If I could talk to Nathaniel, I just want him to know that I would give anything for him to come home and to show him how far I've come and to bring him up to that level with me and for him to live the wonderful life I know that he was meant to live.
Nathaniel, we all really love and miss you, and I really need you back. Life is not the same without you.
Nathaniel, if you're out there watching this, or if somebody shows this to you, we just want you to know that we love you so much. And all we want is for you to come home safe. We're not angry at you. We love you. And we just...
The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., slicing through the thick Florida humidity like a blade, and by sunrise a quiet Gulf Coast town would be stamped with 2 words it would never shake: cold case. August 2003. Clearwater, Florida. Tourist brochures promised white sand and harmless sunsets, but behind a row of pastel condos on Bayview Drive, red and blue lights flickered against stucco walls, turning palm trees into jagged silhouettes. A young woman lay motionless on her living room floor, the television still humming static, the sliding glass door cracked open just enough to let the night air drift inside. No sign of forced entry. No scream heard. No witness brave enough, or awake enough, to see what slipped in and out before dawn. Her name was Melissa Grant. 27 years old. Elementary school teacher. Known for handwritten thank you notes and strawberry cupcakes on Fridays. The kind of name that never belongs in a headline. Until it does. When officers stepped inside, they saw order. Couch cushions straight. Dishes clean in the rack. A half-folded load of laundry resting on the armchair. Nothing overturned. Nothing shattered. Just Melissa, her body positioned almost gently, as if placed rather than dropped. One wound. Precise. Intentional. A single act that turned a peaceful condo into a crime scene. The first patrol officer would later say it felt wrong. Too quiet. Too staged. As if someone had pressed pause on her life and walked away. Detectives arrived before the sun burned through the morning haze. Yellow tape sealed off the walkway. Neighbors gathered in pajama pants and bathrobes, whispering words like impossible, and she was so sweet. A fisherman across the canal claimed he'd heard a car door slam around midnight. Another neighbor mentioned seeing a dark sedan idling with its headlights off earlier that week. Small details. Fragments. Nothing solid enough to hold. Inside, crime scene technicians moved carefully, gloved hands lifting fibers, photographing every angle, dusting for prints that might speak. There were smudges on the sliding door handle, partial impressions on a wine glass in the sink. A faint footprint near the patio tiles, too distorted to match immediately. They bagged everything. Catalogued everything. Because when a life ends without warning, the smallest speck can become a lifeline. Melissa's family arrived by mid-morning. Her mother collapsed against the hood of her car. Her father stood frozen, jaw clenched, staring at the building as if he could will it to rewind. Reporters gathered before lunch. Satellite trucks lined the street. The first headline flashed across local television screens by noon: teacher found dead in Clearwater condo. By evening, it had sharpened: mysterious murder shocks quiet community. Detectives began with the obvious. Boyfriend. Ex-boyfriend. Co-workers. Anyone who had argued with her, dated her, envied her. Melissa had recently ended a short relationship with a man named Darren Cole. 32. Bartender. Minor record, disorderly conduct, nothing violent. He told police they'd split amicably. Said he was working the late shift the night she died. Surveillance footage from the bar placed him there until 1:40 a.m. The drive to Melissa's condo took 20 minutes without traffic. Possible, but tight. His hands showed no visible injuries. His story did not crack under initial questioning. Friends painted a portrait of routine. Melissa graded papers at her kitchen table. Jogged every other morning along the marina. Called her sister every Sunday. She wasn't reckless. She didn't invite strangers home. Yet someone had entered that condo without breaking a single lock. The autopsy confirmed what detectives feared. Time of death, between midnight and 1 a.m. No defensive wounds. Toxicology negative. She had likely known her killer, or at least felt no immediate threat when the door opened. That detail rippled through the investigation like an undertow. Known offender. Trusted face. A smile at the door before everything went dark. Weeks turned into months. Tips flooded the hotline. A landscaper claimed he'd seen a man lurking near the dumpsters days before the murder. A psychic from Orlando insisted the killer's name began with an R. Detectives chased every lead, every whisper, every rumor that might bring shape to the shadow hovering over Bayview Drive. Forensic testing in 2003 had limits. DNA was collected from beneath Melissa's fingernails, trace amounts, frustratingly partial. Not enough for a definitive profile. The smudged print on the wine glass belonged to her. The footprint near the patio was too common a tread to isolate. No weapon was recovered. The case cooled, but it did not disappear. Each anniversary brought fresh headlines. Cold case, who killed Melissa Grant? Her photograph aged only in memory while the town changed around it. New condos rose. Old neighbors moved. The condo itself sold twice, each new owner aware they were sleeping inside a question mark. Detective Luis Ramirez carried the file long after others rotated out. He kept a photograph of the crime scene pinned inside his desk drawer. Not out of obsession, he told colleagues, but out of refusal. Refusal to let it drift into the archive of unsolved tragedies. In 2006, a break seemed imminent. A drifter arrested in Tampa for assault boasted about getting away with something bigger years earlier. He had lived briefly in Clearwater in 2003. Detectives interrogated him for hours. He enjoyed the attention. Smirked through the questions. But his DNA did not match the partial profile from Melissa's case. Another dead end. The community's shock hardened into caution. Parents walked their children to bus stops. Condo associations installed brighter lights, sharper cameras. Melissa's classroom was renamed in her honor. Her students, now teenagers, spoke about her in hushed tones, as if she were a character from a cautionary tale rather than a real woman who once tied their shoelaces. By 2010, the file had thickened with paper, but thinned with hope. Technology advanced in quiet leaps. DNA databases expanded. Forensic genealogy began whispering possibilities law enforcement barely understood in 2003. Ramirez, now grayer at the temples, requested the evidence be retested using newer methods. It was a long shot. It was always a long shot. Lab technicians reopened sealed envelopes. They extracted what little genetic material remained from the preserved samples. This time, they didn't look for a full match. They searched for fragments, patterns, relatives. Months passed with no word. Ramirez attended retirement parties, watched younger detectives take over desks once occupied by veterans of the early 2000s. Melissa's case lingered like humidity, ever present, invisible, heavy. Then, in late 2018, a call came from the state lab. The partial DNA profile had produced something. Not a direct hit. A familial link. A distant cousin in a public genealogy database. Third or fourth degree. Enough to build a tree. Enough to narrow branches. Detectives partnered with forensic genealogists, who mapped out extended family lines across Florida and Georgia. Names multiplied. Hundreds of them. They filtered by age, by gender, by proximity to Clearwater in 2003. The list shrank. Then shrank again. One name circled back with quiet persistence, Ryan Whitaker. 34 in 2003. Lived 2 blocks from Melissa's condo at the time. No serious criminal record. Worked as a delivery driver. Moved to Jacksonville in 2005. Married. 2 children. On paper, he was ordinary. Invisible in the way many people are. But records showed something curious. In 2003, he had reported a minor cut to his hand treated at an urgent care clinic the day after Melissa was killed. He claimed it happened while fixing a kitchen cabinet. Ramirez felt the old pulse of adrenaline return. A decade and a half compressed into a single breath. Detectives conducted discreet surveillance. They collected discarded DNA from a coffee cup Whitaker threw away outside his workplace. The lab compared it to the preserved evidence from 2003. This time, the technology did not hesitate. Match. The word echoed through the department like a gunshot. 15 years. Hundreds of interviews. Thousands of pages. And now, a name anchored to the silence. But an arrest was not immediate. Prosecutors needed airtight certainty. Detectives revisited old timelines. In 2003, Whitaker had told neighbors he barely knew Melissa, though they had crossed paths at community gatherings. Phone records, long buried, revealed brief calls between them weeks before her death. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to suggest familiarity. When officers finally knocked on his Jacksonville door in early 2019, Whitaker answered calmly. His wife stood behind him, confusion etched across her face as detectives mentioned Clearwater, 2003, Melissa Grant. For a flicker of a second, something shifted in his expression, not panic, not rage, but recognition. A ghost stepping forward. He denied everything. Said he'd been home that night. Said he had no reason to harm her. But science, patient and relentless, had waited 15 years to speak. News of the arrest detonated across Clearwater, Florida. 2003 cold case solved. Arrest after 15 years. The headline rolled across national screens. Neighbors who once whispered in bathrobes now stared at each other in disbelief. He lived 2 blocks away. He attended barbecues. He smiled at passing joggers. In interrogation, confronted with the DNA match, Whitaker's composure thinned. Detectives pressed on the lack of forced entry. On the absence of defensive wounds. On the familiarity. Hours stretched. Silence thickened. And somewhere in that sterile room, beneath fluorescent lights that revealed every tremor, the carefully preserved secret of 2003 began to fracture, the past pushing forward with a force that could no longer be contained, the quiet Gulf Coast night replaying itself in the minds of everyone who had waited, year after year, for the darkness inside that condo to finally answer back. The interrogation room felt smaller than it was, the air heavy, fluorescent lights humming like distant insects, and Ryan Whitaker sat, with his hands folded too neatly on the metal table, as if posture alone could hold back 15 years of silence. Detectives didn't rush him. They let the DNA speak first. They let the timeline breathe in the space between questions. Clearwater. August 2003. Bayview Drive. Melissa Grant. Each word placed carefully, like stepping stones across a river he had crossed long ago, and hoped had dried up behind him. He kept his voice level. Said he barely knew her. Said the calls were casual, neighborhood stuff, a borrowed tool, a question about condo association fees. But phone records showed late evening contact. Not once. Not twice. Patterns that suggested something more deliberate. Detectives slid photographs across the table, the sliding glass door, the living room, the single wound. He looked. He blinked. He swallowed. And then he looked away. Outside that room, Clearwater was reliving 2003 in high definition. News vans returned to Bayview Drive. Neighbors who had once whispered now spoke openly to cameras. He was quiet. He kept to himself. You never know what's behind closed doors. The same phrases recycled, but this time they carried a name. Back in 2003, Whitaker had told investigators he was home alone the night Melissa died. No one to confirm. No digital trail strong enough to contradict. In an era before smartphones mapped every movement, alibis were softer, more porous. Detectives at the time had canvassed the area, knocked on his door, asked routine questions. He answered politely. Cooperative. Unremarkable. He had blended into the background of his own neighborhood like a piece of furniture no one thought to move. Now, with the DNA match confirmed, the past rearranged itself into sharper focus. The partial profile recovered beneath Melissa's fingernails, so faint in 2003, had found its missing half. Prosecutors built the narrative carefully. Familiarity explains the open door. No forced entry suggests trust. A cut on his hand the next day aligns with defensive contact, however brief. The science was stronger than memory. But Whitaker did not confess. Hours turned into a marathon of denial. He suggested contamination. Suggested a lab error. Suggested that maybe he had visited her condo weeks earlier, and that explained everything. Detectives countered calmly. The DNA was not from a casual handshake. It was intimate. It was violent. It was consistent with a struggle too brief to leave visible defensive wounds, but long enough to mark skin. When they placed him under arrest, the metal cuffs clicked shut with a sound that seemed to echo across 15 years. His wife watched from the doorway, face drained of color, their children inside the house unaware that the ground beneath their family had just shifted forever. The extradition to Pinellas County drew national attention. Neighbor charged in 2003 teacher murder. The words felt surreal to those who had once left porch lights on out of fear of a stranger. The stranger had lived 2 blocks away all along. In court, Whitaker stood straight, eyes forward, as the judge read the charges. First-degree murder. Premeditation implied. Intent inferred. He pleaded not guilty. For Melissa's parents, older now, grief had calcified into something quieter, but no less heavy. They sat in the front row, hands intertwined, listening as prosecutors described forensic genealogy, a phrase that hadn't existed in their vocabulary when their daughter was buried. They had aged 15 years waiting for a knock on the door that finally came not with condolences, but with a name. Investigators revisited every corner of 2003, searching for motive. Financial records showed nothing dramatic. No large transfers. No blackmail. Friends revealed that Melissa had mentioned a persistent neighbor, who made her uncomfortable, though she never filed a complaint. She brushed it off at the time. Said she could handle it. That detail, once insignificant, now glowed under scrutiny. Detectives reconstructed the likely sequence. Whitaker calls her late that night. Says he needs to talk. Perhaps apologizes for something. She opens the sliding door, August air, familiar face, no alarm. Conversation turns tense. Maybe she rejects him. Maybe she threatens to tell someone about unwanted attention. The exact spark remains locked inside a moment no one else witnessed. But something shifts. Something snaps. A single decisive act ends her life before she can scream. The precision of the wound suggested control. Not frenzy. Not chaos. Control. Yet even with DNA and circumstantial reinforcement, the prosecution knew juries demand clarity. They combed through Whitaker's past. In 2001, a former co-worker had filed an internal complaint about inappropriate comments. It never escalated to charges. In 2004, months after Melissa's death, he abruptly moved from Clearwater to Jacksonville, citing better opportunities. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it looked like retreat. Defense attorneys prepared their counterstrike. They argued that partial DNA from 2003, amplified and reinterpreted years later, could be misleading. That genealogical databases are not infallible. That proximity does not equal guilt. They painted Whitaker as a family man blindsided by evolving science. The courtroom became a battleground between past limitations and present precision. Experts testified about degraded samples, about probabilistic genotyping, about statistical certainty measured in astronomical odds. Jurors listened, faces tight with concentration, absorbing science that didn't exist when Melissa's classmates left flowers outside her condo. Outside, Bayview Drive residents grappled with a different tension. Relief tangled with betrayal. For years, they had feared a drifter, a passing predator. Now they confronted the idea that evil had worn a neighbor's smile. That the man who waved while collecting mail might have walked home after extinguishing a life. Reporters dug deeper into Whitaker's history. Old yearbook photos surfaced. Wedding pictures. Social media snapshots of family vacations. The contrast between image and accusation fueled endless commentary. How does someone carry a secret like that? How does ordinary life coexist with extraordinary violence? In jailhouse interviews requested by media outlets, Whitaker declined to speak. Through his attorney, he maintained innocence. Said he looked forward to clearing his name. The phrase sounded rehearsed, fragile against the weight of forensic data. As pre-trial motions unfolded, another revelation emerged. In 2003, Whitaker had purchased a specific brand of knife weeks before the murder. The receipt, long buried in archived bank statements, resurfaced during renewed investigation. The murder weapon had never been found, but the blade type matched the wound profile described in the autopsy. Circumstantial, but compelling. Melissa's sister addressed reporters outside the courthouse one afternoon, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "We waited 15 years for this," she said. 15 years wondering who walked past us in the grocery store. Her words cut through the spectacle, grounding it in loss rather than headlines. Inside the prosecution's strategy was a simple narrative: technology caught up with truth. Justice delayed, not denied. But trials are unpredictable terrain. Memory fades. Evidence ages. Defense attorneys exploit every crack. Jury selection began under intense scrutiny. Potential jurors were questioned about their understanding of DNA, about media exposure, about whether they could set aside the emotional gravity of a long unsolved case. Some admitted they had followed the news in 2003. Others had only recently learned the details. Each carried their own threshold for doubt. As opening statements approached, the weight of 15 years pressed into the courtroom walls. Prosecutors described a young teacher, whose life ended in the quietest hour of the night. Defense counsel emphasized the dangers of hindsight, of stitching together ordinary details into a narrative shaped by modern science. And through it all, the image of that condo lingered: the half-folded laundry, the humming television, the sliding door ajar to the humid Florida dark, frozen in time, waiting for a verdict that would either seal the story with certainty or fracture it again, leaving the community suspended between relief and the unbearable possibility that even now, after all these years, the full truth of what happened inside that room might remain just out of reach, flickering like static on a screen that never truly went black. Opening statements began with a silence so complete it felt engineered, the kind of silence that forces every person in the room to confront why they are there. The prosecutor stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked slowly toward the jury box, carrying not just a case file, but 15 years of suspended breath. He did not start with science. He started with a door. A sliding glass door. Unlocked. Slightly open. August air moving the curtains, just enough to suggest invitation rather than intrusion. He painted the night in careful strokes, humid, still, unremarkable. Melissa Grant finishing laundry. A late phone call. A familiar voice asking to talk. No broken lock. No shattered frame. Just trust. And then betrayal delivered in one controlled, irreversible motion. He turned to the jury and said the words that had echoed through clear water for over a decade, cold case. He let them hang there before adding the next phrase, until now. The defense rose with a different tone. Calm. Clinical. They warned against emotion disguised as evidence. Reminded jurors that science evolves, that partial DNA from 2003 is not the same as a pristine sample collected today. They spoke of probabilities, not certainties. They described Ryan Whittaker as a man swallowed by a narrative constructed long after memories had faded and assumptions hardened. Whittaker sat between his attorneys, expression steady, jaw set, eyes occasionally drifting toward the jury as if searching for one sympathetic flicker. From the gallery, Melissa's parents watched him without blinking. The state called its first witnesses, officers who responded that night in 2003. Their voices carried the dust of memory, but the images remained sharp. The patrolman described the glow of the television screen against the dark. The unnatural stillness of the room. The way Melissa's body lay positioned almost carefully, as though the violence had been efficient rather than chaotic. Crime scene photos filled monitors in the courtroom. Jurors leaned forward, some swallowing hard. The half-folded laundry. The wine glass in the sink. The faint footprint on the patio tile. Each image a frozen fragment of a life interrupted. Then came the forensic experts. They explained how technology in 2003 captured only a partial genetic profile, insufficient for a direct database hit. They described degradation, limitations, the painstaking preservation of samples over time. Then they walked the jury through the evolution of forensic genealogy, how distant relatives in public databases can lead investigators down branching family trees until one name remains. Charts appeared on screens, complex webs of cousins, second cousins, once removed. Lines converging on Whittaker. The experts spoke of statistical likelihoods measured not in percentages, but in astronomical ratios. The probability that the DNA recovered from beneath Melissa's fingernails belonged to someone other than Whittaker was so small it required scientific notation. Defense attorneys attacked immediately. Cross-examination was sharp, relentless. They questioned lab procedures. Asked about contamination risks. Pressed on how many hands had touched the evidence over 15 years. The expert held firm, explaining chain of custody logs, sealed packaging, modern amplification methods designed to account for degradation. But doubt is a seed. The defense planted it carefully. Next came the medical examiner. Though retired, he remembered the case. He described the single wound. Precise. Delivered with controlled force. He testified that the lack of defensive injuries suggested Melissa either trusted the person in front of her, or was caught so off guard, she had no chance to react meaningfully. He explained the faint biological material under her nails, consistent with brief contact, possibly as she instinctively reached out in her final seconds. The courtroom air felt thinner as he spoke. Then the prosecution introduced the urgent care record. August 17, 2003. Ryan Whittaker treated for a laceration on his right hand. The timing aligned almost perfectly with the estimated time of death. The record had sat unnoticed in 2003, buried among hundreds of tips and interviews. Now it gleamed under the harsh light of hindsight. The defense countered with alternative explanations. A kitchen repair gone wrong. An accident unrelated to any crime. They reminded jurors that correlation does not equal causation. Former neighbors took the stand. One testified that Whittaker had shown unusual interest in Melissa, offering unsolicited help, lingering during conversations. Another admitted it had seemed harmless at the time. He just seemed around, she said, searching for a better word. The prosecution introduced phone records next. Late-night calls between Whitaker and Melissa in the weeks leading up to her death. Brief but consistent. The final call placed just hours before she was killed. Defense attorneys argued that phone contact proves nothing about violence. The prosecutor replied quietly, "It proves access." Whitaker watched each witness with measured composure, occasionally whispering to his attorneys. But when Melissa's sister took the stand, something shifted in the room. She described her last conversation with Melissa, plans for a family visit, laughter about classroom stories. She recounted how Melissa had once mentioned feeling uneasy about a neighbor who didn't take hints. She had not remembered the name at the time. Now she did. The defense objected to portions of her testimony as speculative. The judge sustained some, overruled others. The jury listened to grief filtered through 15 years of endurance. Outside the courthouse, cameras captured every recess break. Legal analysts debated the strength of genealogical evidence. Social media churned with polarized certainty. Some declared justice inevitable. Others warned of over-reliance on evolving science. Inside, the prosecution made a calculated move. They played a portion of Whitaker's 2019 interrogation. On screen, he appeared composed at first. Denials delivered smoothly. But as detectives confronted him with the DNA match, a subtle tremor entered his voice. He asked how certain the science was. He asked whether secondary transfer could explain it. The questions sounded less like confusion and more like strategy. The jury watched his face closely. When the state rested, the defense began constructing its alternative reality. They called their own forensic expert, who acknowledged the DNA match, but emphasized the complexities of low-template samples. He explained phenomena like allele drop-in and drop-out, technical language that hung in the air like fog, thick enough to obscure clarity if one stared too long. They suggested that Melissa may have had other visitors in the days before her death. That DNA can persist in environments longer than people assume. That proximity in a condo complex increases innocent contact opportunities. Whitaker chose not to testify. It was a calculated silence. Taking the stand would expose him to cross-examination. Remaining silent allowed the defense to maintain controlled ambiguity. Jurors were instructed not to interpret his silence as guilt. But silence has its own weight. Closing arguments approached like a gathering storm. The prosecutor returned to the image of the door. He reminded jurors that no forced entry meant familiarity. That the DNA was not random environmental trace, but located where instinctive human contact occurs during violence. He spoke of patience, of science catching up with a lie told in 2003. The defense urged caution. They warned against convicting a man based on technology jurors might not fully grasp. They asked whether the state had proven motive beyond speculation. They reminded the jury that doubt, even small doubt, must result in acquittal. When deliberations began, Clearwater held its breath again. Hours passed. Then a full day. Then another. Jurors requested clarification on DNA statistics. Asked to review phone records. Sought replays of interrogation footage. Each request signaled careful consideration rather than quick emotion. On the third afternoon, a note reached the judge. A verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled in minutes. Melissa's parents gripped each other's hands. Whitaker stood, shoulders squared, but eyes flickering for the first time with something unguarded. The foreperson rose. The word that followed would either close a chapter frozen since 2003 or fracture it once more, sending the town spiraling back into uncertainty, proving that even with science sharpened and patience exhausted, the truth can remain as fragile and combustible as that humid Florida night when when a door slid open and never truly closed again. The word landed heavy, final, reverberating off the courtroom walls like a door slamming shut, after 15 years left ajar. For a split second, no one moved. The air itself seemed stunned. Then sound rushed back in, someone sobbing in the gallery, a chair scraping, the sharp exhale of a community that had been holding its breath since 2003. Ryan Whittaker did not collapse. He did not shout. His jaw tightened, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if the verdict were a language he refused to understand. His attorneys placed steadying hands on his shoulders, already whispering about appeals, about process, about the long road still ahead. But the jury had spoken, and the echo of that single word carried beyond the courthouse steps, beyond Bayview Drive, beyond the humid night where everything began. Melissa's mother wept openly now, her face buried in her husband's chest. 15 years of anniversaries marked by candles and questions had condensed into this moment. Justice, at least in the legal sense, had arrived. Not swiftly. Not cleanly. But decisively. Outside, cameras captured the aftermath. Florida 2003 cold case solved. Guilty verdict after 16 years. The headline rolled across national screens within minutes. Reporters described it as a triumph of forensic genealogy, a landmark example of science resurrecting buried truth. Analysts debated the implications. How many other cold cases waited for the same technological reckoning? But inside the holding cell beneath the courthouse, the narrative felt less triumphant. Whittaker sat alone on a steel bench, wrists cuffed in front of him, staring at the concrete floor. The composure he had worn like armor during trial showed cracks now, subtle but there. He asked a deputy for water. His voice was dry. Sentencing would come later. Life in prison without parole was expected. Prosecutors had already signaled they would seek the maximum. The state had not pursued the death penalty, citing the passage of time and evidentiary limitations, but the weight of a life sentence in Florida is its own quiet finality. In the weeks that followed, Clearwater adjusted to a new reality. The phrase unsolved murder no longer attached itself to Melissa's name. The condo on Bayview Drive, once synonymous with mystery, became a landmark of resolution. Some residents felt safer. Others felt unsettled in a different way, forced to confront how proximity does not equal predictability, how danger can live 2 blocks away and still feel invisible. During sentencing, the courtroom filled again. Prosecutors detailed the ripple effect of Melissa's death, students who grew up without their favorite teacher, parents who aged under the strain of unanswered questions. They described Whittaker's silence as a second cruelty, a refusal to confess even when science cornered him. Melissa's sister approached the podium with steady hands. She spoke not of anger, but of absence. Of birthdays celebrated with an empty chair. Of watching her own children reach the age Melissa would forever remain. You took more than her life, she said, voice unwavering. You took years from all of us. Whittaker declined to make a statement. The judge imposed life imprisonment. The gavel fell. Another sound like a door closing. Appeals followed, as they often do. Defense attorneys challenged the admissibility of genealogical evidence, argued that the jury had been overly influenced by evolving science presented as certainty. Legal scholars watched closely. The case had become more than a local tragedy. It was a national reference point in the expanding role of DNA databases. Months passed. The conviction held. For Detective Luis Ramirez, now nearing retirement, the case file that had occupied his desk drawer for over a decade was finally archived with a different label, closed. He visited Melissa's grave one afternoon without cameras, without ceremony. He placed a small bouquet of white lilies against the headstone and stood in silence. Closure, he knew, is a complicated word. But accountability matters. Truth matters, even when it arrives late. Yet even with a verdict secured, questions lingered like humidity after rain. Motive had been inferred, but never fully illuminated. Whitaker had not confessed. The exact trigger, the precise words spoken inside that condo, remained locked inside a man who chose silence over explanation. The community understood what happened in legal terms. Emotionally, some fragments would always be missing. Documentaries soon followed. Podcasts dissected the timeline. Experts praised the meticulous preservation of evidence. Others warned of ethical gray zones in genealogical searches. Melissa's face, once confined to local broadcasts, appeared on streaming platforms, her story retold with cinematic tension. Through it all, one image persisted, the sliding glass door slightly open to the Florida night. In interviews years later, jurors described the moment they reached consensus. It wasn't dramatic, they said. It was gradual. A layering of facts until doubt no longer outweighed reason. The DNA. The timing of the cut. The phone calls. The proximity. Each element alone might have been questioned. Together, they formed a pattern too cohesive to ignore. Whitaker began serving his sentence in a state correctional facility far from Clearwater's shoreline. Prison records would later note his reserved behavior, his minimal interactions. To other inmates, he was just another number. To Clearwater, he was the answer to a question that had echoed for too long. On the 20th anniversary of Melissa's death, the town held a candlelight vigil, not for justice this time, but for memory. Children who had never known her stood beside adults who still remembered the shock of 2003. They spoke about kindness, about vigilance, about the quiet strength of families who refused to let names fade. As dusk settled over Bayview Drive, the air felt different than it had that August night 2 decades earlier. Not lighter exactly, but steadier. The mystery that once hovered like a storm cloud had dissipated, replaced by the sober understanding that evil does not always arrive with noise or warning. Sometimes it knocks softly. Sometimes it already has a key. And somewhere beyond the reach of cameras and courtrooms, beyond headlines and legal arguments, the final truth of what transpired in those last seconds inside Melissa's living room remains known only to two people, one silenced forever, the other condemned to live with a memory he will never fully share, while the town that once whispered, "cold case," now carries a different phrase in its collective memory: solved, but never forgotten. Prison intake is not cinematic. There is no dramatic music, no final glance over a shoulder as the gates close. There is paperwork. Fingerprints. A number replacing a name. And on a gray morning in early spring, Ryan Whitaker stepped into a concrete processing corridor, where the fluorescent lights buzzed louder than any headline ever had. Outside those walls, Clearwater had already begun rewriting its own story. Real estate listings no longer mentioned the unsolved murder. True crime podcasts shifted from speculation to analysis. The phrase, "Florida 2003 cold case solved," became shorthand for forensic perseverance. But inside the state correctional facility, the word "solved" meant nothing. It did not shorten nights. It did not quiet memory. Whitaker kept to himself. Correctional officers described him as compliant, reserved, not a problem inmate. He requested access to the law library within his first week. Appeals paperwork moved forward with clinical precision. Legal language replaced neighborhood gossip. Back in Clearwater, something else was unfolding. With the case officially closed, the evidence room was reorganized. Boxes labeled Grant, Melissa were moved from active shelves to archival storage. An evidence technician catalogued each item one final time, before sealing them into long-term preservation. The sliding door handle. The fabric samples. The envelope that had once held the fragile strands of DNA. Objects that had carried the weight of mystery now rested as artifacts of resolution. Detective Ramirez, officially retired, struggled with the stillness. For 15 years, the case had been a low-frequency hum in his life. Now the hum was gone. He found himself revisiting small details in his mind, not because he doubted the verdict, but because human instinct resists sudden silence after prolonged tension. He remembered the first time he stood in that condo. The television static. The air conditioner kicking on and off. The way Melissa's living room looked more like a paused evening than a crime scene. Even with a conviction secured, that image refused to soften. Media requests continued for months. Journalists wanted to know what it felt like to solve a cold case after so long. Ramirez answered carefully. He spoke about teamwork. About technology. About persistence. He did not speak about the nights he woke at 3 a.m. replaying interrogation footage in his mind. Meanwhile, Whitaker's defense team filed a formal appeal, arguing that forensic genealogy lacked sufficient precedent, that jurors may have been swayed by the narrative power of new science, rather than hard proof. Legal scholars debated the boundaries of privacy in public DNA databases. Civil liberties advocates warned of slippery slopes. Prosecutors countered with confidence in statistical certainty. The case, once defined by silence, now generated academic panels and law review articles. Melissa's parents avoided most of it. They had endured 15 years of uncertainty. They had no appetite for legal philosophy. They focused instead on smaller rituals, visiting her grave on Sundays, maintaining a scholarship in her name for aspiring teachers. For them, justice was not theoretical. It was personal. It had a courtroom date and a life sentence attached. Yet even within that resolution, a thin thread of unease lingered in the community. Because Whitaker had never confessed. There was no recorded admission. No detailed reconstruction from his own lips. The prosecution's narrative filled in the gaps logically, coherently. But logic is not the same as confession. Some residents whispered that they wished he had spoken, if only to explain why. Why her? Why that night? Why a single, controlled act inside a quiet condo? Speculation persisted despite the verdict. Did he plan it? Or was it a confrontation that escalated in seconds? Did he believe he would never be caught? Or did he carry quiet fear for 15 years, waiting for a knock that never came until technology caught up? In prison, Whitaker maintained innocence in letters to his family. Portions of those letters later surfaced in media reports. He wrote about wrongful conviction. About flawed science. About faith in the appeals process. He never mentioned Melissa by name. The appellate court reviewed transcripts, examined expert testimony, parsed language used in jury instructions. Months turned into a year. The conviction stood. Clearwater moved forward in visible ways. New businesses opened along the marina. Condo renovations modernized Bayview Drive. But certain residents admitted that they still glanced twice at sliding glass doors before bed. Trauma reshapes habits long after headlines fade. On the 21st anniversary of Melissa's death, a local news station aired a retrospective. They juxtaposed grainy 2003 footage with crisp 2019 courtroom clips. The contrast in resolution mirrored the contrast in certainty. Technology had sharpened. Memory had aged. One segment featured a forensic genealogist explaining how distant relatives unknowingly helped identify Whitaker. She spoke about responsibility, about balancing justice with privacy. Every case is different, she said. But when evidence sits waiting for decades, it deserves the chance to speak. In a quieter corner of town, a former neighbor admitted something to a reporter that she had never said publicly. In 2003, a week before the murder, she had noticed Whitaker standing near Melissa's patio at dusk. He claimed he was looking for a lost cat. She thought nothing of it at the time. Memory, she realized too late, can overlook warning signs when they appear ordinary. That confession of observation, late, harmless in legal terms, added another layer to the story. It suggested preoccupation, presence, a subtle orbit tightening before impact. Inside his cell, Whitaker marked time differently. Court dates replaced holidays as milestones. He read legal texts, filed motions, adjusted to institutional rhythm. But there were moments, according to a correctional officer who later spoke anonymously, when his composure faltered, when news segments replayed in the common area, and the words, "cold case solved," flashed across the screen. He would leave the room abruptly, jaw clenched, eyes hard. Whether that reaction stemmed from guilt, anger, or simple exhaustion remained unknowable. Years earlier, in 2003, investigators had feared the killer might strike again. That fear had haunted the town more than any single detail. But no similar crime ever surfaced tied to Whitaker. No hidden pattern of violence emerged. Melissa's death appeared singular, contained within that one humid night. That fact offered a sliver of comfort, though it did not erase the horror of the act itself. In time, the case became curriculum in law enforcement seminars. Evidence preservation. The importance of revisiting cold files. The power and limits of emerging technology. Melissa's name was spoken in training rooms far beyond Florida's coastline. And yet, for all the professional lessons extracted from the tragedy, the emotional core remained simple and unaltered. A young teacher opened her door to someone she believed she recognized, and trust was met with lethal intent. As the years stretched further from 2003, the immediacy of shock softened into historical memory. Children who once lit candles at vigils became adults with children of their own. They told the story differently, less about fear, more about perseverance. Less about mystery, more about eventual accountability. But late at night, when the Gulf air turns thick and the world feels suspended between breaths, some longtime residents admit they still think about that television humming in an otherwise silent room, about how close the answer always was, about how the man who carried the secret walked the same sidewalks, saw the same sunsets, lived beneath the same Florida sky for 15 years before science finally forced the past to speak, and how even with a verdict carved into record books, the final seconds inside that condo remain locked in a space no courtroom can ever fully illuminate. Time does not erase a crime scene. It just builds around it. By the 25th year since Melissa Grant opened her sliding glass door, Bayview Drive looked almost unrecognizable. Fresh paint, reinforced locks, security cameras mounted discreetly under eaves. The condo itself had been renovated twice, new flooring, new fixtures, walls repainted in soft coastal tones that tried to suggest serenity. But foundations remember what walls attempt to forget. The phrase, Florida 2003 cold case solved, had settled into legal archives, into search engine results, into the quiet confidence of detectives, who now cited the case as proof that no file is ever truly dead. Yet for those who lived through it, the story had layers that never made headlines. In prison, Whitaker's appeals had narrowed. Federal review denied. State review exhausted. The life sentence stood firm, immovable. His letters became less frequent. Family visits diminished over time. A correctional counselor later described him as withdrawn, reflective, not disruptive. The system had absorbed him, reduced him to routine. But outside, something unexpected surfaced. A freelance investigative journalist began revisiting the case, not to challenge the verdict, but to explore what had been left unsaid. She interviewed former classmates, neighbors, even jurors willing to reflect years later. She uncovered small details that had never shaped the outcome, but added texture to the night itself. One detail stood out. 2 days before her death, Melissa had called her sister and mentioned planning to file a minor complaint with the condo association about unwanted attention. She hadn't sounded frightened, just irritated. The journalist tracked down old association meeting minutes from August 2003. Whitaker's name appeared on the attendance list that month. Routine. Ordinary. But proximity repeated enough times begins to feel less accidental. The journalist also obtained archived weather data from that night. A brief power fluctuation had occurred in parts of Clearwater around 12:42 a.m., not a blackout, just a flicker. Enough to reset digital clocks. Enough to create a momentary disorientation. The significance was unclear, but the timestamp aligned closely with the estimated time of death. Coincidence? Almost certainly. But in cases like this, coincidence always feels loaded. Her reporting reignited quiet conversation. Not about guilt, that had been decided, but about understanding. Motive remains the most human of questions. Why? It lingers longer than how. Former detectives reiterated their belief that rejection had been the catalyst. A fragile ego confronted with boundaries. A neighbor who misread politeness as invitation. The prosecution's theory had rested there, and jurors had accepted it. But without confession, the exact spark remained speculative. In prison interviews granted years later to a criminal psychology researcher, Whitaker spoke carefully, measured. He maintained innocence. Claimed the justice system needed victories. Claimed his case became symbolic. He avoided specifics. When asked directly about Melissa, he paused for a long time before responding, "I think about that night more than anyone realizes." He did not elaborate. That single sentence circulated widely. For Melissa's family, it felt like an intrusion. For others, it felt like the closest thing to acknowledgement he had ever offered. Interpretation fractured along emotional lines. Meanwhile, advancements in forensic science continued accelerating. Cases older than Melissa's were reopened across the country. Names pulled from obscurity. Arrests made decades later. The Clearwater case became part of a larger narrative, technology as time traveler, retrieving truths once thought buried permanently. Detective Ramirez, now fully retired and living inland, watched these developments with a mixture of pride and unease. He believed in the conviction. The evidence had been strong. But he also understood the fragility of public trust in evolving science. Every solved case strengthens faith, he once said in a lecture. Every mistake weakens it. Clearwater's annual vigil grew smaller over the years. Not because people forgot, but because remembrance no longer required public spectacle. The town had integrated the tragedy into its identity. It was a chapter, not an open wound. And yet, late one summer evening, something happened that stirred old nerves. A break-in occurred 3 blocks from Bayview Drive. No injuries. Minor theft. The suspect apprehended quickly, a teenager. But the flashing red and blue lights against palm trees triggered muscle memory in longtime residents. Trauma does not disappear, it waits dormant. News outlets briefly referenced the 2003 case while reporting on the new incident. The comparison felt unnecessary to some, inevitable to others. History has a gravitational pull. In prison, Whitaker marked 25 years since the murder with no visible change in routine. But according to internal reports later obtained through public records, he requested access to archived trial transcripts again that month. He spent hours reviewing testimony. Experts speculated about why. Searching for inconsistencies. Reliving the narrative. Trying to rewrite memory in private. The question of remorse remained unanswered. Melissa's former students, now in their 30s and 40s, occasionally shared memories online. Stories about her encouragement. About the way she stayed after school to help struggling readers. These posts rarely mentioned the crime directly. They focused on life, not death. It was a subtle reclamation. The condo on Bayview Drive eventually changed ownership again. The new residents installed impact-resistant glass and modern security systems. They knew the history before purchasing. They described it as the resolved chapter. But sometimes, neighbors noticed lights flicking on late at night, silhouettes moving near the sliding door, as if the architecture itself invited reflection. Years layered over years. Appeals quieted. Media interest shifted to newer cases. The phrase, "cold case solved," attached itself to other cities, other names. Yet in certain moments, humid evenings when the air feels suspended, when televisions hum softly in darkened rooms, the memory sharpens again. Not as panic. Not as shock. But as a reminder of how ordinary life can pivot in seconds. How trust can be weaponized. How patience, measured in decades, can eventually corner truth. And somewhere inside a concrete cell far from Florida's coastline, a man who once walked freely under Gulf sunsets sits with whatever version of that night lives in his mind, unaltered, rehearsed, or haunting, while the town he left behind continues forward, carrying the knowledge that justice arrived, but only after time itself had to become an investigator, and that even when a case is stamped solved, the silence that preceded the answer never completely fades. There is a difference between a case being closed and a story being finished. By year 30, Clearwater no longer flinched at the mention of 2003, but it never spoke of it lightly either. The condo complex on Bayview Drive had a new name now, rebranded, renovated, reimagined, but longtime residents still referred to it in hushed shorthand. Not out of fear. Out of memory. Melissa Grant would have been 57. That number hit differently than 27 ever did. 27 is potential interrupted. 57 is perspective imagined but never lived. Former students, now teachers themselves, sometimes calculated her age in quiet moments. They pictured the gray at her temples, the laugh lines earned from decades in classrooms. They imagined her retiring near the water she once loved. And then the math would stop, always at 2003. In a correctional facility hundreds of miles away, Ryan Whitaker turned 64, behind reinforced glass and steel. Age does strange things to certainty. According to periodic psychological evaluations, he remained composed, articulate, consistent in his claims of innocence. No outbursts. No dramatic confessions. Just a steady, controlled narrative maintained over decades. But time has a way of loosening edges. A prison chaplain later described conversations with Whitaker that hinted at something deeper, not admission, not denial, but weight. He carries something, the chaplain reportedly said in a recorded interview years later. Whether it's guilt or grievance, I can't say. But it's heavy. The appeals process had long since dried up. Barring extraordinary legal shifts, Whitaker would never walk free again. The legal system had spoken with finality. Yet the human system, the one made of memory, rumor, reflection, continued evolving. A university criminology department revisited the case as part of a broader study on long-term psychological impact in communities affected by violent crime. Researchers interviewed Clearwater residents who had lived there in 2003 and never left. Their responses varied. Some described a permanent recalibration of trust. Locked doors even in daylight. Caution with neighbors they barely knew. A subtle awareness that evil doesn't always announce itself. Others described something else: resilience. The way the community rallied. The scholarship fund that persisted. The vigil that transformed from grief to gratitude over time. One interview stood out. A woman who had lived directly across from Melissa in 2003 admitted that for years she replayed a small interaction from the week before the murder. She had seen Whitaker walking past Melissa's patio at dusk. She had waved. He had waved back. Ordinary. Harmless. "If I had known," she said decades later, "would I have done anything differently? I don't know." That's the part that stays with you. It wasn't guilt. It was proximity. The unsettling realization that history sometimes unfolds in plain sight, disguised as routine. Meanwhile, advancements in forensic science kept accelerating. Cold cases from the 1980s, the 1970s, even earlier, were reopened and solved through genealogical tracing. Each success story reignited discussion about privacy, ethics, and justice. Melissa's case was often cited as an early example of the method's effectiveness. It had become a benchmark. Detective Ramirez passed away quietly at 78. In his obituary, the Melissa Grant case was mentioned not as a trophy, but as a testament to persistence. At his memorial service, a former colleague recalled how he refused to let the file gather dust. He believed evidence had a memory, the colleague said. He just had to wait for it to speak. Whitaker, informed of Ramirez's death through prison channels, reportedly requested to read the obituary. No one knows what he thought as he read it. Clearwater marked the 30th anniversary, with a smaller gathering than previous milestones. No television crews this time. No national coverage. Just candles along the marina, and a few quiet speeches. Melissa's niece, now older than Melissa ever was, spoke about legacy. About choosing kindness despite fear. About refusing to let violence define identity. As the sun dipped below the Gulf horizon, the sky streaked orange and violet, the same colors it had worn on countless evenings before and after August 2003. Nature, indifferent to human tragedy, continued its rhythm. But in private moments, some residents still wondered about the exact seconds inside that condo. The tone of the final conversation. The expression on Whitaker's face. The realization, on both sides, that something irreversible had just happened. The absence of confession left a vacuum no verdict could entirely fill. In prison, Whitaker's health began to decline gradually. Nothing dramatic. Just the accumulation of years in confinement. He walked slower. Spent more time in the infirmary. The once sharp edges of his posture softened. A corrections officer, who had worked the facility for decades later shared an observation: the men who are innocent fight differently. The guilty ones sometimes they just get tired. It was not a scientific statement. It was a human one. And it lingered. Clearwater, now home to a new generation, taught its children about safety in ways shaped subtly by 2003. Not through fear, but through awareness. Lock doors. Trust instincts. Speak up when something feels wrong. Lessons born from a single night that altered an entire town's understanding of vulnerability. And still, the phrase endures: Florida 2003 cold case solved, not just as a headline, but as a reminder that time can be both enemy and ally. That silence can stretch for years before fracturing under the weight of science. That justice, when it arrives late, carries a different texture than justice delivered swiftly. Some nights, when the air turns heavy and televisions hum softly in dark living rooms, long-term residents admit they feel a flicker of the old unease, not fear of another crime, but memory of how suddenly everything changed once before. Because even though the case is closed, even though the verdict stands firm and the appeals have faded, the story of that sliding glass door, open just enough to invite trust, remains embedded in the collective consciousness of Clearwater, a quiet echo beneath the surface of daily life, reminding everyone who remembers that the past may be resolved on paper, but it never fully releases its grip on the human heart. By the time 40 years had passed, the word cold in cold case no longer described temperature. It described distance. Generational distance. Emotional distance. The kind that turns lived memory into archived footage. Clearwater in 2043 was sleeker, smarter, wired with technology that would have seemed like science fiction in 2003. Facial recognition at marina entrances. AI-assisted patrol systems scanning license plates in real time. Condos equipped with biometric locks instead of sliding latches vulnerable to trust. Security had evolved. But vulnerability, human vulnerability, remained unchanged. Melissa Grant would have been 67. Her name now appeared in digital textbooks, under sections discussing forensic genealogy breakthroughs of the early 21st century. Students studying criminal justice learned about the case not through shock, but through charts and case summaries. They analyzed it the way medical students study historical surgeries, clinical, precise, detached. But for the few who still remembered her laugh in person, detachment was impossible. Whitaker, 74, moved with the slow economy of someone whose world had shrunk to concrete corridors and scheduled medication. Age had hollowed his face, thinned his hair, softened the once defiant set of his jaw. He had outlived both of Melissa's parents. That fact circulated quietly through Clearwater years earlier, stirring a fresh wave of emotion, anger for some, weary resignation for others. In prison records, he remained consistent, no admission of guilt. No dramatic reversal. Just the same assertion repeated across decades, wrongly convicted. Misinterpreted science. A narrative built on probability. And yet, a former inmate who once shared a recreation yard shift with him told a journalist something different. He talked about regret, the inmate claimed. Didn't say what for. Just said regret is louder at night. The comment was impossible to verify. But it spread. Meanwhile, advances in DNA interpretation had become even more refined. Algorithms capable of reconstructing degraded samples with unprecedented clarity. Cases once considered conclusively solved were occasionally re-examined, not because of doubt, but because science demanded precision. A small group of legal reform advocates petitioned for periodic review of older genealogical convictions nationwide, including Whitaker's. Not to exonerate blindly, but to validate conclusively under modern standards. The motion wasn't fueled by Clearwater. It was part of a broader legal evolution. The state quietly retested preserved evidence using updated sequencing tools. The results reaffirmed the original match. Statistically stronger. Cleaner. Even less room for ambiguity. The confirmation never made national headlines. It was a brief legal update, buried in regional news feeds. But for Clearwater, it carried quiet significance. The science that once felt cutting edge had now been double-checked by a future more advanced than anyone in 2019 could have imagined. The verdict held across time. In Bayview Drive's newest renovation, the original sliding glass door frame had long since been replaced. But during a structural upgrade, contractors uncovered an old section of subflooring beneath layers of remodels. Nothing evidentiary remained, everything had been collected decades earlier, but the discovery triggered a familiar ripple in local memory. Physical spaces remember even when surfaces change. A documentary series revisited the case on its 40th anniversary. Not sensational. Reflective. It focused less on the crime and more on the arc of justice delayed. Interviews with retired jurors revealed how heavy the deliberation had felt. One juror admitted they still occasionally replayed the DNA testimony in their mind, even after subsequent retesting validated their decision. Melissa's scholarship fund had grown quietly over the decades, supporting dozens of future teachers. At the anniversary vigil, smaller now, almost intimate, recipients shared stories about classrooms filled with children who would never know the name Melissa Grant, yet were indirectly shaped by her legacy. Legacy. It's a word crime cannot fully erase. Whitaker's health declined more sharply in his mid-70s. Chronic conditions compounded. Infirmary stays lengthened. A prison nurse later described him as restless during quiet hours. He asked once, according to medical notes, whether inmates ever recorded personal statements before death. The question raised no immediate alarm. Many aging prisoners consider legacy in their own way. He never formally requested a confession recording. Clearwater, in its modern rhythm, no longer lived in the shadow of the case. New tragedies had come and gone. New headlines flashed and faded. But when locals were asked about defining moments in the town's history, August 2003 remained near the top. Because it was the moment innocence fractured. Not the innocence of believing crime didn't exist. That illusion had always been thin. But the innocence of believing proximity equals safety. Of assuming a familiar face cannot harbor lethal intent. On humid nights, Florida still humid, technology unable to change climate. Older residents sometimes sit on renovated balconies overlooking the marina and remember that specific stillness from decades ago. The way the air felt before sirens cut through it. The way morning sunlight revealed what darkness concealed. Justice arrived. Science prevailed. The killer was identified, convicted, contained. And yet the emotional mathematics of loss remains unsolvable. Inside a prison room far from salt water and palm trees, an elderly man closes his eyes each night beneath artificial light. Whether he replays that August evening with clarity, distortion, or denial is known only to him. Memory can be both courtroom and prison. Clearwater moves forward as all towns do, layering new stories over old foundations. Children ride bikes past Bayview Drive unaware of what once unfolded behind reinforced glass. Tourists photograph sunsets that look identical to the ones that existed in 2003. But beneath the polished surface of progress lies a permanent imprint, a reminder that time may solve a case, but it never restores the life paused mid-laundry, mid-conversation, mid-breath. The headline declared it solved. History confirmed it. And still, somewhere between the sliding of a door and the silence that followed, there remains a moment frozen beyond reconstruction, a final exchange lost to everyone except the two people who stood inside that condo when trust shifted into violence, leaving behind a community that learned, over decades, that closure is not the absence of memory, but the endurance of it. 50 years. Half a century since the night the television hummed to an empty room and a sliding glass door stood open to humid darkness. Clearwater in 2053 no longer resembles the postcard town of 2003. The skyline has risen modestly. Sea walls are higher. Storm systems are tracked with precision satellites that didn't exist when Melissa Grant graded papers at her kitchen table. Time has reshaped geography, technology, even climate patterns. But it has not erased August 16th. Melissa would have been 77. For most residents now, she exists as a name engraved on a scholarship plaque inside a modern elementary school built on higher ground after hurricane reforms. Children pass it daily without knowing the full story. Teachers sometimes explain gently, "She was one of us. She believed in classrooms filled with light." Ryan Whitaker is 84. Age has reduced him to careful steps and monitored medication schedules. He occupies a medical wing now, his world narrowed to short hallways and supervised recreation. The once tight composure seen in 2019 courtroom footage has long since faded into something quieter. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just worn. Prison files describe him as reflective, withdrawn, no longer engaged in legal pursuits. The appeals have ended. The arguments exhausted. The life sentence has done what it was designed to do, outlast him. A graduate student researching long-term incarceration interviewed Whitaker under supervision that year. The interview transcript, later published in an academic journal, contained a line that unsettled Clearwater when it resurfaced online. When asked what he thinks about most often from before prison, he responded, "A door. And how small decisions become permanent." He offered no elaboration. The ambiguity felt intentional. Speculation reignited briefly. Was it remorse disguised as abstraction? Was it bitterness? Was it simply aging memory compressing events into symbols? No one could say. And he refused follow-up interviews. Clearwater's 50th anniversary vigil drew more historians than reporters. True crime had evolved into immersive digital reconstructions by then, interactive timelines, AI-generated simulations of past events. A technology firm even proposed creating a virtual walkthrough of the 2003 condo layout for educational purposes. Melissa's surviving relatives declined permission. Some spaces, they argued, should not be rendered into entertainment. The town agreed. Instead, the anniversary focused on reflection. The mayor spoke about perseverance. A retired forensic scientist described how the case helped accelerate national protocols for evidence preservation. A former student, now nearing retirement herself, shared how Melissa once stayed after school to help her through a reading disorder. The story drew quiet tears. The narrative had shifted fully from crime to impact. Yet beneath the commemorative tone, one truth remained stark. A single controlled act had carved a permanent line through decades of lives. Legal scholars continued referencing the case in discussions about genealogical ethics. By 2053, DNA databases were heavily regulated, consent structures refined after years of debate. Melissa's case remained one of the earliest widely publicized successes of the method, a turning point when science reached backward and caught someone who believed time had erased risk. In Bayview Drive's latest iteration, sliding glass doors are nearly obsolete. Smart paneled walls slide silently with biometric authorization. Security sensors log every entry and exit. Trust is no longer assumed, it is verified. But even the most advanced systems cannot detect intention. A retired corrections officer, interviewed anonymously for the anniversary, described Whitaker in recent years as quieter than quiet. He spends hours staring at nothing in particular. Sometimes at his hands. Sometimes at the narrow window slit that reveals only sky. When asked about behavior patterns, the officer paused. He seems tired. Not physically. Just tired. There are no dramatic deathbed confessions in this story. No sudden reversals. No final courtroom bombshell decades later. The evidence has been retested. The verdict reaffirmed. The science validated across generations. And yet the absence of a spoken why lingers like humidity after sunset. Clearwater's younger residents process the case differently. To them, it is history. A solved mystery from a time before omnipresent surveillance. They struggle to imagine a world where someone could live 2 blocks away from a crime scene and avoid detection for 15 years. Their disbelief is not moral, it is technological. The idea feels primitive. But those who remember 2003 know how easily ordinary life can fracture. They remember the shock of seeing patrol lights flicker against palm trees. They remember locking doors earlier than usual. They remember glancing twice at neighbors they once waved to casually. Memory ages, but it does not dissolve. Whitaker's health declined further that winter. Hospital transfers became more frequent. Prison officials prepared standard protocols for elderly inmates with life sentences. No special treatment. No ceremony. Just documentation. Clearwater did not celebrate his decline. There was no appetite for vengeance by then. Only distance. Only the steady rhythm of a town that had learned to carry its past without letting it dictate the present. One humid evening on the anniversary itself, the Gulf reflected a sky streaked gold and indigo. The marina was quiet. Candles flickered along the water's edge, their reflections trembling slightly in the tide. A child, too young to know the history, asked her mother why everyone was so quiet. "Because we're remembering," the mother said. Remembering what? A teacher who loved her students. Not a murder. Not a cold case. Not a trial. Just a teacher. Inside a medical unit far away, an elderly man closed his eyes as machines hummed softly in the background. Whether he saw a courtroom, a prison corridor, or a sliding glass door in his mind is unknowable. Memory is private territory. 50 years later, the case remains solved. The science stands stronger than ever. The conviction unshaken. The town transformed but intact. And still, beneath the layers of technology, legislation, and time, the core of the story remains brutally simple. One night, one door, one decision that became permanent, leaving behind a community that learned justice can arrive late, but arrive nonetheless, and that even when history settles into textbooks and archives, the quiet echo of that August darkness never fully disappears from the air it once filled. The file is thicker now than it ever was in 2003. It sits inside a climate-controlled archive at the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, catalogued, digitized, cross-referenced, its contents duplicated across encrypted servers that will likely outlive everyone who once touched the original evidence bags. Melissa Grant's name is printed along the spine in clean, modern type. Beneath it, a classification that once carried frustration and doubt now reads with sterile finality: homicide, cleared by arrest. But clearance is not erasure. In the years following Whitaker's conviction, investigators did something unusual. They reopened their own process. Not to challenge the verdict. Not to entertain conspiracy. But to audit themselves. To understand how a man living within walking distance evaded suspicion for 15 years. The internal review became required reading in law enforcement seminars across Florida. It dissected every early decision, the initial neighborhood canvass, the assumption of stranger danger, the failure to prioritize peripheral acquaintances. It highlighted cognitive bias, the tendency to search outward rather than inward when violence feels unthinkable. The report's language was clinical, almost cold. We overestimated distance and underestimated familiarity. Clearwater residents who read that line felt it land heavily. Familiarity. Whitaker had waved at neighbors. He attended local HOA meetings. He borrowed tools. He discussed hurricane preparedness over backyard fences. He was not invisible. He was present. That realization lingered long after the courtroom lights dimmed. True crime documentaries came calling within months of the sentencing. Production crews wanted interviews in front of the original condo. Drone shots over Bayview Drive. Reenactments of the sliding glass door drifting open in the humid night. Melissa's family declined most requests. They did not want her reduced to a streaming thumbnail. One production moved forward anyway, focusing on the forensic breakthrough rather than the personal tragedy. It became widely watched, praised for its explanation of genetic genealogy. It featured lab technicians describing how a distant cousin's casual upload of DNA to a public database triggered the chain reaction. A single consumer decision. A recreational curiosity about ancestry. And suddenly, a decades-old crime had a name. The documentary ended with triumphant music. Clearwater residents watched in silence. For them, there was no triumph. Only gravity. Whitaker never spoke publicly again after sentencing. No prison interviews. No memoir. No appeals framed as philosophical protests. He withdrew into institutional routine. Breakfast trays. Head counts. Medical evaluations. Aging. Corrections officers noted that he avoided discussion of the outside world. When news played on communal televisions, he kept his eyes lowered. When asked about visitors, he declined most requests except for brief family check-ins that grew less frequent over time. One guard later described him as the man who realized time had finally caught up. In 2031, nearly 3 decades after the murder and 12 years into his sentence, Whitaker filed a single-page handwritten request to access educational programming inside the facility. He enrolled in a course on ethics and criminal justice offered through a remote university partnership. He completed assignments, submitted essays, passed quietly. The irony was not lost on anyone. A man convicted through advanced forensic science studying the moral frameworks of law enforcement and punishment. His final paper, according to archived academic notes, centered on unintended consequences. It did not reference his case directly. It examined how small personal grievances can escalate when unexamined. It cited philosophers. It avoided confession. But between the lines, some readers sensed proximity. Outside prison walls, Clearwater evolved. The condo on Bayview Drive changed ownership multiple times. Renovations erased the 2003 layout entirely. Walls were moved. Flooring replaced. The sliding glass door upgraded to reinforced hurricane-grade composite with integrated alarm systems. New families built new routines within those rooms. Children slept where detectives once dusted for prints. Life does not pause for tragedy. It reclaims space. Melissa's scholarship expanded over the years. Former recipients gathered annually to network, mentor, and share progress. Many entered education. Some pursued forensic science, citing the case as a turning point that inspired their careers. One became a public defender. Another a victim's advocate. The ripple effect widened in directions no one could have predicted. Meanwhile, legal scholars debated privacy boundaries as genealogical databases grew exponentially. Some argued the Grant case proved the system worked. Others warned of overreach. Court precedents referenced the investigation repeatedly, shaping national standards for how law enforcement could access familial DNA. Melissa's name appeared in legal textbooks' footnotes. A life reduced to citation. In 2040, a wildfire of misinformation briefly flared online. A fringe blog claimed alternate suspects had been ignored. It cited misinterpreted fragments from the original case file released under public records law. Within days, experts dismantled the claims. The physical evidence had been retested with next-generation sequencing methods. Results matched Whitaker conclusively. The science held. Yet the episode reminded Clearwater of something uncomfortable. Even solved cases can be destabilized by rumor. Truth requires maintenance. As the decades layered on, new officers joined the sheriff's department, who had not yet been born in 2003. During orientation, they reviewed archived footage of the press conference announcing the arrest in 2018. They watched seasoned detectives struggle to contain emotion as they described knocking on Whitaker's door. One trainee later admitted the footage unsettled him more than crime scene photos. Because he looked so normal, he said. Normal. The word persists like a warning. In the prison medical wing, Whitaker's world narrowed further. By the early 2050s, mobility aids became necessary. Conversations shortened. His voice thinned. Staff documented occasional insomnia. When asked what kept him awake, he reportedly answered once, noise. What kind of noise? Old noise. He refused to clarify. Clearwater, by contrast, had grown louder over the years, tourism expanding, infrastructure modernizing, hurricane seasons intensifying then stabilizing with improved mitigation. The town no longer felt fragile. It felt fortified. Yet each August 16th, a deliberate quiet settled over Bayview Drive around dusk. Residents, many of whom had moved there long after 2003, participated without fully understanding the original fear. They lit candles. They stood in respectful silence. Not because the mystery endured, it did not, but because memory demanded acknowledgement. Solved does not mean forgotten. In 2053, Whitaker's health crisis escalated. Hospital equipment surrounded his bed. Legal status unchanged. Sentence intact. Guards rotated shifts as required. No dramatic media presence. No helicopters overhead. The world had moved on from spectacle. When news eventually broke that he had passed away under medical supervision, it arrived as a brief bulletin. No banner headlines. No breaking news graphics. Just a paragraph confirming the death of a man convicted in one of Clearwater's most infamous cold cases. Reaction was muted. There were no celebrations. No protests. Only a subdued sense of closure folding into an already closed chapter. Melissa Grant's story had long since shifted from unsolved horror to enduring impact. Whitaker's death altered nothing about the evidence, the verdict, or the scholarship fund bearing her name. And yet, as evening settled over the Gulf that day, some longtime residents stepped outside instinctively, as if listening for something they could not quite define. The air felt heavy but calm. The sliding glass doors along Bayview Drive reflected the sunset in seamless panels of reinforced glass. Inside, families prepared dinner. Televisions murmured. Homework was completed at kitchen tables. The same domestic rituals that once framed the beginning of a nightmare. Now, they frame survival. 50 years from the crime, decades from the arrest, years from the sentencing, and finally the quiet note of the convicted man's death, the timeline felt complete. A circle drawn slowly, patiently, by science and time. But the emotional geometry remains more complex. Because even in a case solved beyond dispute, even after prison gates close and obituaries print, there is a residue that does not dissolve, the knowledge that evil does not always arrive as chaos. Sometimes it walks home under familiar streetlights. Sometimes it smiles across hedges. Sometimes it lives 2 blocks away, and waits 15 years for a knock on the door that will end everything. Clearwater learned that lesson once. It has never unlearned it. There is a photograph that rarely appears in documentaries. It was taken 3 days before Melissa Grant died. Not a posed portrait. Not a school staff headshot. Just a candid image snapped by a colleague during a late afternoon planning session. Melissa is leaning over a desk, sleeves rolled slightly, laughing at something outside the frame. Sunlight cuts through classroom blinds, striping the wall behind her in warm gold bands. There is nothing dramatic about it. No foreshadowing. No shadow lurking at the edge. No ominous detail. Just a woman mid-laugh, alive in a moment that had no idea it was almost over. That photograph became central decades later, not in court, not in evidence, but in memory. Because as the case aged and then resolved, the image resisted the gravity of violence. It reminded Clearwater that before the headlines, before the term cold case, before the science and the arrest and the sentencing, there was simply a person moving through an ordinary week. Ordinary weeks are fragile. When the conviction became final and the appeals exhausted, some residents expected a collective exhale. They expected relief to arrive clean and uncomplicated. But relief proved layered. Parents felt safer knowing the threat had been identified. Teachers felt validated that persistence and advocacy had mattered. Investigators felt vindicated by the science. Yet beneath those responses lingered a quieter emotion, unease at how long the truth had lived nearby, unnoticed. Whitaker's death years later did not erase that unease. Psychologists studying community trauma often reference Clearwater as a case study in delayed resolution. They describe how uncertainty alters behavior more deeply than confirmed danger. For 15 years, the unknown had shaped routines, earlier curfews, reinforced locks, suspicious glances. When the unknown finally acquired a name, the habits remained. Even now, long after his passing, many residents double-check sliding doors without consciously remembering why. Memory embeds in muscle. In the sheriff's archive, alongside forensic reports and trial transcripts, there is a timeline printed across multiple pages, every significant moment from August 16, 2003, to the final appeal ruling decades later. It reads like a compressed epic: discovery, investigation, stagnation, technological revolution, arrest, trial, imprisonment, death. But timelines flatten emotion. They do not capture the way humidity clung to uniforms during the original canvas. They do not capture the tremor in a detective's hand when the genealogical match finally narrowed to a single household. They do not capture the silence inside the courtroom when the verdict was read. They record facts. Clearwater carries the rest. Younger generations inherit the story differently. For them, it is a lesson in science and accountability. They grow up in a world where DNA is routine, where databases are expansive, where the concept of evading forensic identification feels almost naive. They view the 15-year gap as an artifact of technological infancy. Older residents know it was more complicated than that. It was human hesitation. It was assumption. It was the discomfort of suspecting someone familiar. It was the way communities protect their sense of normalcy even when cracks begin to show. In quiet interviews conducted for academic research years after Whitaker's death, former neighbors described subtle moments they had dismissed at the time: an odd comment, a lingering stare, an unexplained absence during community searches. None were definitive. None would have justified accusation. But in hindsight, they shimmer with unsettling possibility. Hindsight is sharp. During the 50th anniversary events, one speaker posed a question that lingered in the coastal air: what does justice look like when it arrives decades late? No one answered immediately. Because justice, in this case, did not restore a life. It did not rewind a night. It did not erase fear from the years in between. It identified responsibility. It imposed consequence. It clarified truth. Sometimes that is all justice can do. The condo on Bayview Drive stands renovated beyond recognition now, but local historians preserved architectural blueprints of the original layout. Not for spectacle. For record. For the acknowledgement that physical spaces can hold historical weight even when walls are replaced. Tourists rarely ask about the case anymore. It is not part of marketing brochures. Clearwater prefers to showcase sunsets, beaches, resilience against storms. Yet beneath its polished surface, the town understands something enduring. Safety is not a guarantee. It is a practice. Melissa's former students, now grandparents themselves, sometimes recount stories that have nothing to do with crime. They remember how she encouraged reluctant readers. How she decorated her classroom with ocean themes. How she insisted that curiosity was stronger than fear. Those memories feel rebellious against the narrative of violence. They insist on complexity. Whitaker, in his final recorded medical notes, was described as non-communicative but alert. There were no dramatic final statements. No written confession discovered among belongings. If remorse existed, it remained private. If denial persisted, it ended with him. The absence of a spoken motive continues to intrigue criminologists. They analyze patterns, personality assessments, circumstantial triggers. They debate whether understanding motive truly provides comfort, or merely rearranges pain into explanation. Clearwater has largely stopped seeking explanation. It has accepted the shape of what happened without demanding philosophical clarity. Perhaps that is its final evolution, not from shock to resolution, but from obsession to steadiness. And yet, on certain humid nights, when the Gulf air presses heavily against reinforced windows, longtime residents still recall the original darkness. They remember the patrol lights reflecting off palm fronds. They remember news vans lining the street. They remember the phrase that once defined their town, unsolved. That word is gone now. Replaced by solved. Closed. Cleared. But language does not fully contain impact. Because what endures is not only the fact that science caught up with a man who believed he was beyond reach. What endures is the quiet realization that evil can coexist with familiarity for years without detection. That community bonds are strong, but not omniscient. That time, relentless and patient, eventually narrows even the widest uncertainty. The photograph of Melissa laughing remains framed in the elementary school office. New teachers pause before it occasionally, reading the small plaque beneath. They see a colleague. A predecessor. A reminder. Outside, children run across playground asphalt warmed by Florida sun, their voices bright, and unaware of archival files, or court transcripts, or prison obituaries. Life continuing. That is the final, unspoken resolution. Not the arrest. Not the conviction. Not even the death of the convicted. But the fact that classrooms are still filled, doors are reinforced yet open, and a community once defined by a cold case now defines itself by endurance. 50 years ago, a sliding glass door stood open to darkness. Today, the doors close softly, securely, against a night that no longer feels infinite. The past remains recorded, catalogued, undeniable. But it no longer dictates the horizon. Long after the headlines faded and the court transcripts were archived, one question continued to circle quietly through academic circles and law enforcement conferences: what if the science had not advanced when it did? It is an unsettling thought experiment. In 2003, DNA was powerful but limited. Databases were narrow. Cross-state cooperation was slower. The idea that a distant cousin's recreational genealogy upload could unravel a homicide felt like speculative fiction. If that technological leap had arrived 10 years later, if public databases had restricted access sooner, if one relative had chosen privacy over curiosity, would Melissa Grant's case still be a file stamped unsolved? The margin between justice and oblivion can be razor thin. Detectives who worked the case into retirement sometimes admitted that, in the years before the genealogical match, hope had thinned. They revisited evidence periodically, reran prints, re-examined fibers, re-interviewed old witnesses. Each attempt felt like pressing on a locked door that would not budge. Cold cases age in strange ways. They do not disappear. They gather dust while simultaneously gathering weight. Every passing year adds pressure. Every anniversary reopens absence. By 2015, some of the original investigators had begun mentoring younger officers with a cautionary tone. Preserve everything, they would say. Even what seems useless. They understood something the public often overlooks: the future may know more than the present. Melissa's case became proof of that philosophy. When the genealogical lead narrowed to a family tree rooted in clear water, the room reportedly went silent. Detectives traced branches carefully: cousins, second cousins, marriages, relocations. They mapped proximity to Bayview Drive. They cross-referenced age, employment, criminal history. And then they saw it. A name 2 blocks away, in 2003. Ryan Whitaker. The ordinariness of the discovery was almost anticlimactic. No dramatic cross-country fugitive. No hidden identity. Just a man who had continued living in the same region, attending community functions, aging quietly as technology advanced around him. It forced a new understanding of what it means for a case to be cold. Cold does not mean distant. Cold can live next door. In the years following Whitaker's death, criminologists analyzed behavioral patterns in unsolved neighbor-on-neighbor crimes. They studied how social familiarity shields suspicion. How the mind resists associating violence with routine faces. Clearwater's experience became a reference point not because it was unique, but because it was disturbingly plausible. Ordinary proximity is powerful camouflage. For Melissa's family, the scientific debates and policy reforms were secondary. What mattered was certainty. The knowledge that the uncertainty had ended. They did not need a philosophical explanation of motive. They needed the assurance that the question of who would not haunt future generations. Closure is rarely cinematic. It is administrative. It arrives in certified letters, in final rulings, in the absence of pending motions. And then life resumes its slow forward motion. Clearwater's law enforcement community changed structurally after the case. Dedicated cold case units received increased funding. Evidence storage facilities were modernized with redundant preservation systems. Annual reviews of dormant files became policy rather than aspiration. Melissa's name was cited in budget meetings. A life-influencing infrastructure. Meanwhile, public perception of forensic science evolved. Early enthusiasm for genealogical breakthroughs was tempered by ethical concerns. Courts refined standards for probable cause derived from family matches. Consent laws tightened. Oversight committees formed. Progress matured into regulation. The Grant case remained part of that dialogue, a reminder of both the power and the responsibility embedded in technological reach. In classrooms where Melissa once taught, curriculum units eventually incorporated discussions about digital footprints and personal data. Teachers used real-world examples, carefully framed, to illustrate how information travels farther than intended. Students debated privacy versus justice with the earnest intensity of youth. Some were surprised to learn that the breakthrough in a decades-old murder hinged not on a confession, but on a database entry made for entirely different reasons. The randomness unsettled them. Whitaker's absence from the world did not create dramatic ripples. No memoir surfaced. No secret archive of revelations. His belongings were processed according to standard correctional procedures. Personal items boxed. Records closed. A life reduced to inventory. The contrast between Melissa's enduring community presence and Whitaker's administrative fade-out felt stark. Legacy is not evenly distributed. As the years accumulated, Clearwater's physical landscape continued to adapt to climate pressures. Elevated roadways. Reinforced foundations. Advanced storm prediction systems. The town invested heavily in resilience. Perhaps unconsciously, resilience had become its defining trait long before hurricanes demanded it. It had survived uncertainty. It had survived exposure. It had survived the knowledge that danger once moved quietly among friendly sidewalks. That psychological survival carried into civic identity. On certain evenings, local historians offer walking tours focused not on crime, but on transformation. They speak of infrastructure, demographic shifts, environmental adaptation. If asked about 2003, they answer respectfully but briefly. The case is not hidden. It is contextualized. Because Clearwater refuses to be reduced to a single narrative. And yet, in private conversations, longtime residents admit that the story reshaped how they interpret normalcy. They no longer equate familiarity with safety unquestioningly. They understand that vigilance need not erode kindness, but it must coexist with it. It is a delicate balance. One retired detective, reflecting decades later, summarized it in a single sentence during a recorded oral history: time doesn't forgive. It reveals. Time revealed DNA patterns hidden in microscopic strands. It revealed investigative blind spots. It revealed that patience can be a strategy rather than a surrender. But time did not reveal motive. That absence persists like a faint echo. Some theorize it was opportunistic. Others suggest suppressed grievance. A few speculate psychological fracture triggered by circumstances lost to memory. Without confession, the interior remains sealed. Perhaps that is fitting. Not every darkness yields explanation. As twilight settles over the Gulf now, the water reflects city lights more than patrol lights. The hum along Bayview Drive is domestic and unremarkable. Reinforced doors glide shut with engineered precision. Security systems arm quietly. The night no longer feels infinite. Yet somewhere within Clearwater's collective memory is the understanding that infinity once seemed possible, that for 15 years, uncertainty stretched forward without visible end. Science shortened that stretch. Justice closed it. Time absorbed it. And what remains is not the spectacle of a solved cold case, but the quieter recognition that truth can outlast concealment, that small decisions echo across decades, and that even in a town defined by sunlit beaches and salt air, shadows once lingered long enough to teach an enduring lesson. The file is closed. The archive preserved. The name remembered. And the air, though still heavy with Florida humidity, carries no unanswered question, only the steady rhythm of a community that faced its darkness, waited for its science, and endured long enough to see both converge.